Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Erik Karlsson trade, specifically the one that saw the Sharks send him to the Pittsburgh Penguins, not the one when they acquired him from the Ottawa Senators. So this trade took place a couple of years ago, but the story of it actually starts the year before that. In the 2022 offseason, the Sharks had just fired their general manager, Doug Wilson, and brought in some new leadership here with Mike Grier. And despite the fact that he was very hesitant to actually use the word rebuild, actions speak louder than words, and it was only a few weeks after this hiring that the first domino fell, and the Sharks ended up trading away Brent Burns and not getting back any actual short-term pieces to help them in the immediate next season, a trade that clearly made the Sharks a worse team. This was an indication that the Sharks were kind of open for business here and a bit of a fire sale would start, and there were certain assets that they had that seemed like they could really get back some strong value, in particular Timo Meier being a young, talented player, but others looked a lot more difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of. One of them was Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and we know now, considering he was just bought out a few weeks ago, that indeed that contract wasn't going anywhere. But another one that seemed to be rather untouchable was Erik Karlsson. He was the highest paid defenseman in the entire league, making $11.5 million, and yet the first few seasons of his contract with the Sharks were incredibly underwhelming. It didn't seem as though anybody would want to touch this player with a 10-foot pole. But the 22-23 season was massive for both him and the San Jose Sharks, because they basically gave Karlsson free rein to do whatever he wanted that season. He was the guy, the offense flowed through him, and it ended up with him putting up 101 points at the end of that season, the first defenseman to hit the 100-point mark in many, many years, a record that still stands here now a few years later. And this put Erik Karlsson back on the map. He also picked up a James Norris for his efforts, despite the fact that he did all of this on the fourth worst team in the entire league. Now suddenly teams were a lot more interested, but the thing is that they weren't necessarily interested in taking on a full $11.5 million Erik Karlsson, because while 101 points is extremely impressive, if you're paying a defenseman that much, you want them to be elite on both sides of the puck, and while Karlsson was fantastic offensively, he left a lot to be desired defensively, let's just say. And so it was about really kind of lowering that contract value, which the Sharks could do by retaining money on it. The maximum amount that you can do is 50%, so the Sharks could have retained $5.75 million, at which point Karlsson would be a $5.75 million defenseman, and someone who can put up 101 points at that number is exceptionally valuable. And yet, the rumor at the time was that the Sharks were not willing to retain that much capital. Instead, they were pretty adamant on keeping it within the $1 to $2 million range, and as we saw, that's exactly where it ended up, only retaining $1.5 million on this deal. And I thought that was rather questionable at the time that it happened, and now with the benefit of hindsight 2 years later, it still kind of seems like a strange move, because it is clear that over the last 2 seasons, the Sharks did not need the extra cap space that was saved by doing this, the close to or the over $4 million that they saved by not retaining the maximum amount. And as we move into this next season, in fact, it would have been useful to have that extra $4+ million just to be able to hit the salary cap floor. And going into the 26-27 season also, which would be the final year of Erik Karlsson's contract, I don't think they're going to need the cap space there either, and I don't think it was a crazy prediction to make at the time that San Jose wouldn't need the full benefit of all of their cap space to make things work over those 4 seasons remaining on Erik Karlsson's contract. And so from a strictly hockey perspective, it doesn't make a ton of sense for why Mike Grier was so hesitant to actually do this, which makes me believe that it was not just a hockey perspective taken here, but perhaps a financial one as well. I had mentioned this at the time of the trade, and it remains really the only possible logical explanation, which is that the Sharks ownership just wasn't all that excited about paying $23 million over the course of 4 seasons for a player to not be on the San Jose Sharks, and that only doing it with $6 million, which ended up being the case, was a lot easier of a pill to swallow. That really kind of has to be the perspective here. So Mike Grier, hands perhaps a little bit tied with what he was able to actually do, and yet he made the best of this situation anyway. While the return originally looked somewhat underwhelming on paper, it has worked out exceptionally well for the Sharks for 2 major reasons. The first of which is this first round pick that they got belonging to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Usually when you trade a good player to a solid playoff team, you're going to end up with like a mid to late 20s pick, perhaps even in the 30s. If we go back to the Timo Meier trade with the New Jersey Devils, he was a player traded to a team that was on the way to making the playoffs, and the Sharks ended up getting the 26th overall pick back. Still solid. It was used to pick up Quinton Musty, but not in that top 10, top 15 level. But the thing with the Pittsburgh Penguins is that they were an incredibly volatile team at this point. In fact, they had missed the playoffs the previous season, and then brought in new leadership of their own with Kyle Dubas taking over as general manager, and he decided, interestingly enough, to try and give the veterans of that Pittsburgh Penguins team one last kick at the can, try to get Crosby, Malkin, Letang back into a playoff position for perhaps the final time of their career, at least with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And so he did so by making this big splash by acquiring Erik Karlsson. But the thing was that while Karlsson was able to put up 101 points with the San Jose Sharks, as I mentioned earlier on, he was able to do this because the Sharks gave him free rein to actually do pretty much whatever he wanted. In a structured system that Mike Sullivan runs in the Pittsburgh Penguins, with other players who are at a similar level and pedigree to Erik Karlsson, it's not as easy to pull off, as we have seen during the first few seasons of Karlsson being with the Sharks. When there's a lot more competition for those top spots, he kind of fades back a little bit into the background. You want him to be the number 1 player, and that's not quite what he was with Pittsburgh, and so he took a pretty significant step back, and in the end, the Penguins missed the playoffs yet again. And what was interesting here is that this first round pick was top 10 protected. Had it been, let's say, 7th overall, the Penguins probably would have hung on to it and then passed over their 2025 unprotected first to the Sharks. It wouldn't have been the end of the world, but as we know now, the 2025 draft was a little bit weaker, and in particular was extremely weak on defense, which is what the 2024 draft had in spades. And the Sharks would use this first rounder, which ended up being 14th overall, which means not in that top 10 range, to actually bump themselves up to 11th overall in a trade with the Buffalo Sabres, which allowed them to grab Sam Dickinson, who now currently stands as one of the best defenseman prospects in the entire NHL right now. So a big win to be able to grab that player from such a trade. But that was not all. The second major pickup is in one of these 3 players who at the time were viewed as a pretty simple cap dump, and indeed both Hoffman and Jan Rutta ended up being exactly that. Hoffman didn't do much in the 1 season he played with the Sharks, didn't even get to be traded at the deadline, and now he doesn't even have an NHL contract. The same could be said about Jan Rutta. He played 2 seasons with the Sharks. He was, I guess, serviceable-ish as a 6th or 7th defenseman. The Sharks clearly liked him and played him a ton, and yet he was a player who couldn't get moved at the deadline, perhaps due to injury, but also just not really many takers there, and he also doesn't have an NHL contract. But it was Mikael Granlund who ended up, it's kind of weird to say, but ended up as a diamond in the rough type of player, because while he had been extremely successful during the early parts of his career with the Minnesota Wild, once he got traded to the Nashville Predators, it brought in a lot of inconsistencies in his game. He had a great season with Nashville, but then a couple of not so great ones, and once getting traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins, his stint with the Penguins was quite bad. And this is one of the reasons why teams like to try and pick up these rental players at the deadline that have an expiring deal, because there's not really much risk involved, because if they don't actually work out, they don't gel with your team, well, they're gone that off season. But Granlund still had a couple of years left on his contract, and so the fact that he didn't work out with Pittsburgh, you don't necessarily want to head into 2 more seasons with a player who is not really doing anything with your team. So he was a cap dump in this Erik Karlsson trade, but he was anything but that for the Sharks, because just as Karlsson was given the reins in 22-23, Granlund was given the same thing in 23-24, especially since Logan Couture, the Sharks captain, was injured for the vast majority of that season. So Granlund was the top guy power play wise, along with Tomas Hertl, of course. But he was also the top penalty killing player. He was also just generally getting a ton of ice time, and he managed to thrive in that situation. He put up 60 points and was one of the very, very few reasons for why the Sharks were even remotely watchable in the 23-24 season. And despite getting some reinforcements this past year in 24-25 with Celebrini and Smith coming in, Granlund was still amongst the Sharks' best players, production-wise for sure, and that ended up with him getting traded at the beginning of February to the Dallas Stars, and basically got back a first-round pick from them. Now, this was more of the classical type of trade where this first-rounder ends up being quite late in that opening round, and it ended up being the 30th overall selection, but the Sharks were able to grab Joshua Ravensbergen, who is a very solid goaltending prospect, perhaps even the best goaltending prospect of that draft class. And so in the grand scheme of things here, the Sharks traded Erik Karlsson and got back one of the best defensive prospects currently, and one of the best goaltending prospects of this draft class. That's a pretty good haul. And not only that, the trading of Erik Karlsson is kind of like an addition by subtraction, not necessarily because he was such a terrible player, quite the opposite in fact. He could really will you over the finish line in many different games. He's one of the major reasons for why the Sharks in that 22-23 season managed to finish fourth last instead of probably dead last, which they would have otherwise gotten if he didn't pop off completely and put up 101 points. And if he remained with the team in 23-24, who's to say that the Sharks don't put up a couple of extra wins on the board, despite the fact that that team was so terrible? They only finished a few points below the Chicago Blackhawks for that 32nd place spot, that last place position. And if they bump out of that position, if they pass Chicago in the standings, they don't get the first overall pick, they don't draft Macklin Celebrini, and this team is a lot more directionless than they currently are. So not only do you pick up a couple of great prospects, but you give up a player that ends up also managing to accomplish your goals of tanking that particular season. Now, the two other assets that were additionally traded here by the Sharks, didn't really mention them, but Dylan Hamaliuk didn't make much of an impact at all with the Pittsburgh Penguins. This third round pick, it's notable, and it is actually still live because it is a 2026 third round pick. At the time, that seemed very far in the future, but now it is next year's draft. But still, that is nothing compared to what the Sharks do end up getting from such a trade. So this is another type of Mike Grier deal, just like the Timo Meier trade, that looked rather underwhelming at the time. And yet Mike Grier, as I mentioned, with his hands tied a little bit, perhaps because of the financial situation here with the Sharks, managed to make a lot happen with this contract, getting the Sharks set up pretty well for the future. Class dismissed.